just need to say hello to my computer. Which is going to take a little while to say hello to me. There we go. Thank you. Most energy conversations are about increasing supply. They're not about using energy more productively. And the supply revolution is indeed wonderfully exciting. Modern renewables last year provided 68% of the world's net additions of electric capacity, thanks to their powerful business case. But our greater challenge is in the negawatts, in rapidly expanding energy savings. Because in 2010 to 16, their growth saved 4 times as much global carbon as the total growth in renewables plus nuclear power. In the United States, if our total primary energy demand had kept on growing in lockstep with GDP since 1975, we would have used this much energy. But instead, we cut that use by more than half, saving cumulative energy equivalent to 25 years of current use. Meanwhile, the renewable output doubled, but with 30 times less cumulative impact than the savings. The renewables get nearly all the headlines because they're visible, but energy is invisible, and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. Yet saved energy is even more important. It's now bigger worldwide than oil, and it keeps on expanding. A little history on that. Around 1975, our government and industry all said that the energy needed to make $1 of GDP could never go down. A year later, I heretically suggested it could drop 72% in 50 years. So far, it's dropped 58% in 43 years, but just the innovations already added by 2010 can save another threefold, twice what I originally thought, at 1/3 the real cost. Our 2011 business book, Reinventing Fire, detailed how to triple U.S. energy efficiency and quintuple renewables by 2050, needing no oil, no coal, no nuclear energy, 1/3 less natural gas, while saving $5 trillion, growing the economy 2.6-fold, strengthening national security, and cutting fossil carbon emissions 82 to 86%, yet needing no new inventions, no acts of Congress, but with smart city and state policies led by business for profit. And the first 8 years of this 40-year journey nicely track actual market developments, including in the first half of this year, largely because the private sector smells the $5 trillion on the table. That's just what should be happening. So now we're aiming to double and accelerate the contribution, especially of what I'll call integrative design, and especially in vehicles and buildings, and to help scale it aggressively to its global potential, which is an order of magnitude bigger than the US alone. Now, of Reinventing Fire's triple energy efficiency, 30% came from that light blue wedge integrative design, optimizing buildings, vehicles, and factories as whole systems, not as piles of parts. And that can often make very big energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into increasing returns and making this 8-year-old graph look quite conservative. Now, this year-old article with a fun 4-minute video abstract explains that bigger savings can cost less than the ones we're used to because they come not from adding more or fancier widgets, but from leaving stuff out, from using fewer and simpler widgets, more artfully chosen, combined, timed, and sequenced. Energy efficiency done right doesn't cost more as you save more because it's not a depletable assemblage of atoms like oil or copper. Rather, it's an infinitely expandable assemblage of ideas depleting only stupidity, a very abundant resource. Now, my last 5 slides illustrate efficiency's potential in each energy-using sector, buildings, vehicles, and industry. So buildings use nearly 3/4 of our electricity, and in both new and old buildings, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported 5 years ago the energy savings getting bigger toward the right for diverse types and sizes and climates. And they found the best European new buildings on the left and retrofitted old buildings on the right saved up to at least 90% of their energy use without making the savings cost more per unit. The better projects are all highly cost-effective. Now, most climate models assume from economic theory that such big savings must have steeply rising costs, but some buildings are saving 90+% very cheaply, and whatever exists is possible. The big vertical cost scatter only shows the business opportunity to conform inferior projects to best practice. Here's an eye chart about automotive efficiency. With extra sticker price on the vertical axis and rated fuel efficiency on the horizontal axis, the official technology by technology analytic method yielded the National Research Council's Aqua 2002 high and low supply curves of potential efficiency gains in U.S. light trucks and cars, about 15 years ahead. So the more you save, the more and more steeply the cost of the efficiency rises. And then they added updates in 2015 and caught up with some previously rejected independent analyses. But within weeks, these forecasts were embarrassed by actual market platforms, like those from Honda, Toyota, BMW, by major automakers, aluminum gasoline engine virtual design in collaboration with Rocky Mountain Institute, by Porsche engineering design for the steel industry, morphing steel-based vehicles into RMI's carbon fiber SUV design with a couple of tier 1 engineering firms yielded these light truck and car values. And then here's a roughly 3 to 15-fold more efficient aluminum fleet van that our spin-off road tested in 2009. So there's about 15 data points. And notice that nearly all of them for whole vehicles show savings up to 3-folds bigger and yet cheaper than our government thought possible. So part-by-part analysis misses the right-hand 2/3 of the design space. Analyzing auto efficiency by the part, not the car, makes efficiency look several-fold smaller and cheaper than whole vehicle integrated design can actually achieve. So today's efficiency standards are a lot more conservative than anyone thought, and electrification can be much cheaper and faster than today's heavy autos are yet exploiting. So the second shoe is just now starting to drop. For example, here's a BMW i3 that validates our old hypercar claims from the 90s, and it confirms that a carbon fiber electric car can compete even at 6-year-old carbon fiber prices. Sandy Monroe, who's the normally understated dean of automotive costing in Detroit, called it the most significant vehicle since the Model T and the most advanced vehicle on the planet. And indeed, it reportedly made money from the first unit off the assembly line. How's that? Well, its carbon fiber is paid for by the batteries that its lightness saves. And fewer batteries mean faster recharging. Its integrative design makes the weight savings snowball far more than normally assumed. Its manufacturing is radically frugal, with 1/3 the normal capital and water, half the normal energy and space and time. The conventional body and paint shops are eliminated, with much better conditions for workers, and quadrupled efficiency without compromise brings many driver advantages. This is getting the attention of competitors, some with production intent, and ultimately this approach can displace about 90% of automotive steel and make carbon fiber cheap enough to capture a lot of other markets too. Integrative design, by the way, also permits 3 or 4-fold more efficient trucks and 3 to 5+-fold more efficient airplanes. Now, what about industry, which uses half the world's energy and electricity? Well, RMI's latest $50-odd billion worth of industrial retrofit designs typically found roughly 30 to 60% energy savings paying back in a few years. And you notice they're a lot better than the brown retrofit zone that most energy service companies deliver in that big brown blob in the upper left. And then in new builds, we found even better 40 to 90-odd% savings with generally lower than normal capital cost. Our better results come from rethinking industrial processes and also redesigning basic elements like pump and fan and motor systems. For example, better pipe and duct design in factories and buildings can save about 80 or 90% of their friction. Motors use over half the world's electricity. Half of that's to run pumps and fans. So full adoption could theoretically save 1/5 of the world's electricity, or about half the world's coal-fired electricity, and typically pay back in less than a year in industrial retrofits and instantly in new builds. And yet, you will find this in none, with a minor exception, of the engineering textbooks, no climate model, no industrial forecast, no government study. Why not? Because it's not a technology, it's a design method. And few people yet think of design as a way to scale up big fast. My deep dive on such integrative design in buildings, vehicles, and factories will be at 1:30 this afternoon in the Grand Ballroom. Meanwhile, as I mentioned yesterday in a panel, elegantly frugal use of energy-intensive materials and competing negamiles and negatrips against physical mobility can multiply the savings from efficient materials production and transport. So across the whole range of uses and sectors, the more we dig for savings, the more we discover. The low-hanging fruit, which really just means eye-level fruit, keeps growing back faster than we can harvest it. And therefore, the efficiency cornucopia keeps on expanding. But note that this is the manual model of a cornucopia. You actually have to go turn the crank. You know, somebody once called Fritz Schumacher a crank, and he smiled and gently replied, "I like that. Cranks are simple, they're nonviolent, and they cause revolutions." Thank you.
Have a seat, Amory. No, that's over there. I need that. So this conversation that you really have been running, and the reason that, frankly, a lot of us are here today is because of the work that you have been doing. And it started 43 years ago when you wrote the seminal piece on efficiency, the soft path, as you called it back then, in October 1976. I'm wondering how the conversation has changed, because a lot of this is you've been talking about for a long time. How has this conversation changed in 43 years?
Well, in those days, and you can look back in what we call a paperweight, a yay-thick congressional hearing record Gaylord Nelson's staff put together. In those days, people actually said with a perfectly straight face that you can't save any energy because we're in a market economy, so it's perfectly efficient. And if we try to uncouple energy from GDP, we'll be back to caves and candles. They really said that. And then they said the same thing about electricity, which took about 10 to 20 years longer to decouple than primary energy did, but is now following exactly the same downward trajectory. And a lot of people do efficiency, they make money on it, but I think they tend to do it in a fairly rote way. It's still grossly undercapitalized. It doesn't get much respect because it is invisible. One of the first things I sometimes do working in a factory is have them put a displaying cash flow meter on a big motor, so managers walking by will realize how much money is flowing through that thing, because otherwise you can't see it. It goes to the accounting department as part of a utility bill. How would you know?
Yeah, we have that on the microgrid outside. You can see how much money we're saving.
But you don't know where it goes until you drill down. And then you say, wait a minute, it's using what? I better pay attention to this thing.
So the caves and candle crowd are still out there, and dare I say, in the White House.
I recently met Bob Monroe at a...
Who's Bob Monroe?
I think I have the name right, the coal baron in Ohio, who's close to the president and keeps trying to get his failing coal business rescued. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me of this remark by the ex-oilman Maurice Strong that not all the fossils are in the fuel. I mean, I really had no idea such creatures still walk the earth. It's like coming face to face with a dinosaur.
Well, yes, and those dinosaurs are still in positions of power, and so...
Those business will fail anyway. So, you know, we're closing coal plants twice as fast as we were under Obama.
Right, but there's still the efficiency. I mean, that's when you're closing down coal plants and sunsetting an industry. That's one thing, but still talking about just a lot of the efficiencies that you've been talking about for a long time. There still seems to be either resistance or just like it's not very sexy, and so it still feels like it languishes. It's sort of the last choice instead of the first choice.
Well, it's an afterthought, and some of the best climate protection advocates can do an entire speech on renewables and never mention efficiency, which is over twice as important in decarbonizing. So there's a missing chunk of perception here, which is why I gave some of those examples, and I think when we dig into it more at 1:30, you'll see it's only difficult because it's too simple.
Well,
but there's an important thing going on that we have a paper I hope coming out shortly on called Recalibrating Climate Prospects. Turns out around 2010, there was a sharp acceleration in the world's rate of saving energy and rate of decarbonizing supply. They both reverse slope and got a lot steeper. And the climate models generally haven't picked up on this yet because they use what econometricians call recent data, by which they mean 1980 to 2010. And therefore, there is a lot of doomsaying around based on what we used to do. But actually, if you add up those two rapid intensity gains in less carbon per unit energy and less energy per unit GDP, they are at the pace the last 3 years on average that you would need to sustain to get to 2 degrees, and they're half what we would need to get to 1.5 degrees. So here's a high-level summary. The climate science models were very conservative in stating how quickly and nonlinearly climate could change, the runaway potential. But unnoticed, the integrated assessment models that convert climate science into consequences and choices were at least equally conservative in counting what you could do about it. They counted very little of the efficiency potential and sometimes none. And with these two offsetting biases, what Jeremy Grantham calls the race of our lives is very much on. The outcome depends on what we do each day, and both despair and complacency are equally unwarranted.
well, good on the despair part. That's helpful to hear. But it's still, I think, arguably, we're still not going far enough, fast enough. And it sounds like that one of the key players in all of this are CFOs.
Is what?
CFOs.
Yes.
How do we get them to realize, and I know in some organizations, like, we can save this much, and that's nice, but we can do better dollar-wise investing over here, so why invest in this where it's only X% when we can get 2X? Obviously, they're not factoring in everything and every source of value beyond the dollars. How do we get CFOs to understand what needs to happen and move them forward?
I think you're right that CFOs are a big piece of the puzzle, and not enough people talk to them. They are used to allocating capital actually not according to their discounted cash flow metrics on a corporate-wide basis, but by department. That is, so much will tend to go to R&D, to marketing, to production, and then after that, people compete on IRR or whatever the metric is. But of course, if you let everything compete flat across the company, probably energy efficiency would get all the capital and nobody else would. That wouldn't be politically acceptable, so they don't do it that way. But they shouldn't pretend they're maximizing value in quite the way normally described. And then, of course, the discounted cash flow metrics the CFO uses don't get to the shop floor where they tend to use simple payback. So it's always fun to put an engineer at the same table with the CFO and put in between them a Rosetta Stone translating those two metrics. And the engineer scratches her head a while and says, wait a minute, you told me to get a 1.5-year simple payback, but actually I could do 7 years and still meet your hurdle rate. Why'd you tell me 1.5? And I think a lot of CFOs simply don't realize what more is at stake. Higher quality, higher throughput. In offices, 6 to 16% higher labor productivity, and labor's your biggest cost. So actually, if I'm trying to sell efficiency to a management team, I'll often talk about those things they may care more about. And then at the end, I say, oh, by the way, you'll make 38% IRR on the energy efficiency. I said, wait a minute, we're going to make money on that too? We want to do it for all these other reasons. Why did nobody tell us that?
So I want to get to questions from the sidebar in a second, but the other big player are the energy supply companies, utilities, the power, independent power producers. They don't necessarily want to see efficiency. I mean, at least it's not in their financial interest. How do we ensure that they come along for the ride or maybe even lead it?
Well, in states with traditional utility regulation, we traditionally rewarded utilities, both gas and electric, for selling more energy and penalized them for cutting your bill. So with support from Edison Electric Institute and American Gas Association, we're supposed to be implementing state by state a reform typically called decoupling and shared savings. There are different ways to do it, different names. NRDC and others have been very good at pushing on this, but it's still at only something like, I think it's maybe 19 states for electricity and low 20s for gas. So in the rest of the states, we're still rewarding the opposite of what we want. So that needs to get fixed.
So that's a PUC fix.
That's a PUC fix state by state. We have perfectly perverse incentives. But if you align incentives, as California was the second state to do, it's quite miraculous how it affects culture and behavior. In fact, one of my predecessors as chairman of RMI, John Fox, used to run PG&E's program when it was the biggest and best in the world. And he reports that having added, I think it was 92 or so, $40-odd million to the bottom line that year from efficiency with no cost, no risk to the company, he says if you do that, your CEO will probably call you every week and say, is there anything you need? And all the smartest people in the company will want to come work in the efficiency division to advance their careers. So it's a very important reform. Where you don't have it, you can still compete on efficiency in other ways, but I think strategically, no matter how your company is structured and whether it's regulated, you need to understand the fundamentals of what's going on in electricity. The customers are figuring out pretty fast they can use fewer electrons more productively, more timely. They can make their own. They can trade them with each other. It's usually a good idea to sell customers what they want before somebody else does. And if you invest in a lot of ways to make and deliver electricity and customers are using less of it, you're going to be in a world of hurt.
Yeah. Let's get in a question from sidebar. Sarah, Heather?
Yes, thank you so much for this conversation. It's generating a lot of great questions from the audience. Hi. And one thing that is coming up is that this idea of integrative design is obviously amazing and the potential to be more efficient. But what happens with all of the existing building stock? What opportunities are there to be integrating deeper energy efficiency in existing buildings?
Retrofits are about. And they're one of the more interesting methods which Rocky Mountain Institute's Martha Campbell is and partners are trying to bring to the Bay Area. It comes from Holland, Energiesprong, energy leapfrog, and they do laser measurements on a house, ship those wirelessly back to the factory, where machines then fabricate a kind of tea-cozy of super insulation, air tightening, and a nice facade, and super windows to bolt on around your house. A very high efficiency heat pump drops in, a super insulated photovoltaic integrated roof cranes on, and the result of all that is a net zero house, which has been demonstrated, I think, in the UK to be installable in a single day while you're off at work. Normally, they don't do it quite that fast, but by industrializing the whole process, customized to each building, it's now they've now got the cost down within the last 15% of what it would take to finance entirely from saved energy without subsidy, and they should get there within about another year.
We are kind of out of time, but I do want to ask you one more question, which is, how do you stay hopeful?
Just, wind up the crank every morning, turn the key. No, I'm conscious of what I'm doing, what my colleagues are doing, what people all over the world are doing every day to create a world worth being hopeful about. And I call that approach applied hope. It is not mere glandular optimism. It is not theoretical hope. And it's not optimism or pessimism, which, as Dave Brower taught us, are different forms of fatalism, treating the future as fate, not choice, and not taking responsibility for creating the world you want. But I'm pleased with how quickly things are going and how much opportunity we have to make them go even faster. If you go to rmi.org and search on Berkeley, you will find my Berkeley Natural Sciences commencement speech called Applied Hope, and that will tell you a lot more about it. But just remember, as Raymond Williams says, to be truly radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing.
Well, you have made hope possible for a long time and continue to do that. Thank you for that. Please join me in thanking Amory Lovins.